And now the demographics is working against us because now...
Hi, welcome to the Franklin Public Library. Great Decisions 2025. Tonight we have Pablo Toral speaking about international cooperation and climate change. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge our sponsors, the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation, and Carol and Tom Donovan. So a little bit about our speaker tonight. Dr. Pablo Toral is Professor of International Relations and Environmental Studies at Beloit College. His scholarly interests include international political economy, environmental politics, international relations theory, international governance and development with a focus on Latin America and Europe. Pablo received his PhD in international relations from Florida International University. So I'm going to turn it over.
Thank you. I speak through this, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I think we opened a conversation about this and then we dropped that. Okay. So is this working in the room? What about online? Do we know if
louder?
Louder?
Doesn't sound like it's working at all.
Oh. Maybe. Is this better? No.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it is. Okay, let me make sure that I'll put it here on my tie. I always wonder what the tie is for. It's for okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for hosting me. I actually now hear a little bit of echo, so it's working. Thank you. Thank you also for coming in spite of the fact that I'm a month behind. So I appreciate your flexibility. So this is a topic that I'm very interested in for a number of reasons. It's come up every now and then with the Great Decision series. There's a few things that have happened since the last time I spoke about this. Beloit College has decided to prioritize things such as climate change in our curriculum. So we created a school of environment and sustainability that is housing our 5 environmental studies majors, and one of the pillars of our education is climate change. We study climate change from a science perspective, from a policy perspective, from an economics perspective, from a cultural perspective. So it's a very familiar topic to me. And then at a personal citizenship level as well, I've been in a way sucked into climate policy at the state level in Wisconsin. So, just yesterday we had a legislator come to Beloit for a number of things. And I'm involved with the development of a climate plan for the city of Beloit as well. So I actually have a lot of hands-on experience in this. So normally they tell you in science that you can really get too personal if you don't separate out the science that you do from your initiatives, your agency, your activism. So I don't know to what extent I can do that because this is something that I've been studying, something that I do research on, and something that I've been more involved at a practical level as well. So I don't necessarily see why I shouldn't be involved with climate policy and law at the local level in Beloit, but also Wisconsin level, since I tend to make a lot of noise in the community about this. So a lot of what you see here is informed by the reading, but it's really based on what we're doing in Wisconsin. And so I also try to provoke a little bit, because one of the things that we're doing in Wisconsin is that we're very uneven in the way that we approach climate policy. And this is something that is predicted by social scientists, and I'll point that out later. But I really try to kind of throw the Milwaukee area under the bus a little bit to give you something to think about. I think you guys are bullies and take advantage of poor little Beloit. So I'll tell you that later, but that's kind of like the spoiler alert that's coming. If you want to get the details, wait a few minutes. Okay, so with that, let me tell you a little bit about what kind of brings us together. It's an article that was written by a person that also has, well, I shouldn't say also, I was kind of thinking like me, much more experience at the federal level working in climate policy. So Josh Busby wrote this piece that we're reading today. And one of the arguments, we'll develop that in a minute. Actually, let me give you the strategy or the structure of the presentation. Number one is the key arguments in the essay. But I do want to highlight that the essay is written by someone who has lots of academic and policy prestige in climate change. So this is how I'm going to organize the presentation. I'm going to say, let's meet all in the article and see what the article says. I will offer a little bit of technical background because there's a number of technicalities that are thrown in there that I want to make sure we all understand. Then we'll look at the data. Is the data supporting the argument? Then we'll assess the data. And at that point, I think I'm going to deviate a little bit from the article to just bring it home to Wisconsin, draw some conclusions, and maybe offer some recommendations. So with that, I have a couple of slides on the key arguments in the article. One is that we need to focus on the key emitters of greenhouse gas. So climate change is a problem because we are emitting more greenhouse gases that we can sink back into the ground. The result of that is the trap heat, temperature rises, and that has an impact on the climate. The higher temperature causes ice to melt. There is more evaporation. Because there is more evaporation, there is more moisture in the air, so there is more precipitation when it rains. The weather is also changing, the patterns are changing, so even though we know there is more precipitation, we don't know exactly where it's going to go. The Midwest in particular is going to be facing higher temperatures and more precipitation, that we know, but we don't understand why some regions are getting less, why some regions are getting more. But what we do know is that if we really want to address the problem, this is the low-hanging fruit, which is not very low-hanging actually. These are the major emitters of greenhouse gases. So mitigation, adaptation, those are two terms that we use. Mitigation means we need to address the cause of the problem. Adaptation means we need to acknowledge that with changes in extreme weather patterns, those extremes are here to stay, at least in the short and near term, and we need to adapt and adjust our infrastructure. So these two frameworks for policy. We need to prevent the problem from getting worse and eventually turn back the clock in a way. And two, until we get there, we need to acknowledge that extreme weather is more likely and we need to build our infrastructure, our institutions to address that. And these are the countries, or the actors, we call them actors because they're not all countries. The European Union is not a country, but we see the European Union as a single actor because the EU countries have transferred climate policy to the European Union on the grounds that it is easier if the EU acts together rather than 26 different policies. So the EU does work together as a single actor in international negotiations. So that's why the EU shows up and maybe not Germany or Poland or some of the other countries. From a practical perspective, if we really get these actors that I mentioned here to actually eliminate or lower their emissions, we don't really need to think about the other 190 actors in the world, which makes what we call the collective action problem. If we don't have to have everybody agree to something, why don't we focus on the ones who can make a difference? Fewer people at the table are more likely to agree on something than more people. So if we can get these to agree, we can make a difference. And the argument that the author provides is that the international climate regime, which is a term that we use to refer to the international negotiations, are actually working somewhat well because they are reaching agreement. I'll pause that thought for a moment. So, but the second argument that he develops is that they agree and then they go home with homework and they don't do it. So the question then is, if the international climate regime that involves all of us agreeing on the nature of the problem and the solutions and what we each have to do works, what happens at home? Because we are not all doing it. And that's one of the arguments that the author is developing here. What happens at the national and the local level? And that's one of the arguments that I want to develop. What happens in Wisconsin? What happens in the US? So a little bit of background on the article. If you want to go back to these, or if you don't, it is important for us to think about climate as a global problem, as a local origin. If the cause of climate change is the emission of greenhouse gases that normally come from burning fossil fuels, anything that burns will generate greenhouse gases that get trapped in the atmosphere. They trap the heat. It's like the greenhouse gas effect. So we have two major international organizations that have been created under the sponsorship of the United Nations to facilitate this kind of what we call collective action at global level, to prevent what we call the free riding problem. If the problem is local in origin, but global in scope, why would I fix it? If I do, you get to enjoy a clean environment without doing anything about this. So this is what we call a free riding problem. If I do it, you get the benefits for free. How can I hold you accountable so that we all do it? So to do that, we create international organizations. The idea is that you're gonna do it and I'm gonna do it, call this issue linkage, because when you need my help, I won't give you my help. But if you agree to help me with this, then I'll help you with that whenever it comes, no questions asked, and I'll do that to the best of my ability. Why should we all work together on climate? For two reasons. One, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That is a group of scientists, thousands of them, coming from all over the world, who distinguish themselves because of their expertise on climate. And they're willing to share their expertise for anybody who wants to build on it. So they put it under the IPCC, and if you're coming from a country whose scientists specialize in things different from the ones that you need to act on tomorrow, you can go knock, knock, I need to do this in my country, we don't have in-house expertise. Can any of you come help? Yes, here's what we do. I'm interested in nuclear, we can tell you. We're interested in solar, we've got that too. I'm interested in public health, particularly in arid regions, we've got that. The second one is what we call the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that is the policy legal aspect of it, not the science aspect of it. Based on the science, what do we do? The goal of the UNFCCC is to actually get a group of countries to agree that what we do will be best and most effective if it is informed on the science of the IPCC. And that's how we get the two to work together. And the work of the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention, is to come up with agreements by countries as to what we need to do, how, by when, and how we collaborate. So that is the framework in place to prevent the free riding problem, to also prevent what we call the problem of capacity. What if your country has to do something that it hasn't had to do before, and it doesn't have the scientists, it doesn't have the infrastructure? We don't want to keep you from doing it. We agree to send your people. We agree to send your technology. So that's how it works. And the goal of those two is that we need to meet those targets to keep the temperature from rising above 1.5 degrees centigrade, above 1750. 1750 is what we call the baseline year, because it's when we started to produce greenhouse gases through the industrially, through factories. It's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So if we could go back to that, we would fix the problem. That is the assumption here. The international climate regime has been somewhat successful, but we are on our target if we do what we pledged under the UN Framework Convention. We are going to hold the increase in global temperatures at 2.6 degrees warmer than business as usual, that's where we should have been, which means it's not enough. 1.5 is not ideal, but the scientists believe we might avert catastrophic, cataclysmic weather events that would be irreversible and potentially unknown. So if we can keep it under 1.5, it would be better. Not ideal, but better. And we're not on target yet. Okay, so another important aspect, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is a set of practices and rules that are actually informed by law. If you really mean it, put it in a document, sign it, everybody's bound by it. So we created two approaches. One is what we call the Kyoto Protocol that was signed in the late 1990s, which basically pledged or obligated some countries to lower their emissions by specific target. And it worked up to a point, but it only committed the wealthy countries. And what we know today is that some middle-income and low-income countries such as Indonesia, China, and India will make the problem worse if they don't lower their emissions. And according to the Kyoto Protocol, they were free to pollute. So when the protocol expired, we sat at the table and we decided to come with a new approach. The member countries did not want to be bound by very specific targets at the global level. The US made it very clear, China made it very clear. India, for example, said we are the fastest growing emitter, but I cannot guarantee that I can slow down without hurting my people, my economy. We have hundreds of millions of people we need to pull out of poverty. I don't want to tie my hands to an agreement that I don't know that I can honor or should ethically. I'm not sure. Maybe the fight against poverty is more important. So we came up with what we call a bottom-up approach. It's called the Paris Climate Agreement that was engineered by Peru, Mexico, and Costa Rica. So the representatives of those three countries sat down and said, okay, the big wealthy countries failed. How about we come up with an approach? And one of the arguments is, if we really want to involve China and India, we can't tell them that they have to be bound by anything the US wants them to do. I mean, who on earth would do that? If you're Mexico, you know nothing good can come out of the US, right? Okay, that's the law in Mexico. But what if we can go to Mexico, to India and China and say, the Americans and the Europeans are kind of like really dropping the ball on these. Why don't we just pick it up and run with it? And then we can actually set the rules. And if we set the rules, they have to basically dance to our tune. And that really caught on. India said, I like that. China said, oh, that sounds really good. So basically, a group of climate diplomats from those three countries spent months traveling the world to get all countries, big ones, India, China, little ones, Uganda, Rwanda, to actually agree to this. And then they presented this to the US and China. Instead of taking the Kyoto Protocol, how about a bottom-up approach? We all agree the problem is serious and real, but we're going to let you decide what to do. You tell us what you want to do, you go do it. We just expect that you do something, and that every year you do something a little better. And that really brought everybody back. And that is where we are at right now. So the Paris Climate Agreement mandates that every year countries meet, they share the policies, they update it on their progress, and they face international public scrutiny. And that's that, which really frustrates my students. What happens if we don't do anything? They'll tell you, shame on you. But that doesn't mean they'll do it. That's pretty much what the approach does. And ironically, it's been more effective than Kyoto. Because thanks to that approach, some of the fastest emitters are really now peaking. It's what we call emissions peak. China might have peaked already. Emissions in China are starting to drop. If you look at the graph of emissions in India, it's starting to flatten out. So India might be also reaching that plateau and eventually will lower their emission. So from that perspective, it's been somewhat successful. Not ideal, but it's been successful. What makes this approach work up to a point is what we call, in the law, we talk about hard law and soft law. Hard law is do it or else, there's implications, and soft law is it'd be nice if we did it, and we all know we should. But we don't want to write too much into the contract just in case we won, because we know we might not. And the principles that brought countries to the table are like this. We will agree to cooperate, but if we don't, nothing happens. We will agree to peer review, but after you tell me shame on you, I say, yeah, shame on me. I'm off. We agree to cooperate, but aren't we cooperating just by talking? So this is really what we mean. But the idea behind this is informed by cognitive science, social science. Even though it looks very open-ended and very non-committal, if these representatives of countries meet on a regular basis, they start developing relationships. They socialize each other into agreement. And then they go home and they really push their countries. They really expect us to do something. There's prestige in this. We're all together in this. There's some really interesting studies that have been done in Sweden, in Norway, that talk about how international legislation is more effective if you bring people to the same room forever and you don't tell them what the agenda is. And they'll talk about family and kids. Oh, my wife was sick when I came, and all the kids, I'm going through a divorce right now. I'm not really sure I should be here. Like, oh yeah, I'm on my third one. Okay, so let me tell you about this. Let's go have coffee. You're like, oh, I was supposed to talk about climate. So I mean, I'm acting it out, but that's the way it works. Like, okay, you're gonna get over this, but we need to fix this climate thing. So the Norwegians really pioneered this to facilitate international peace resolutions. They would bring Israelis and Palestinians together, people from different countries, and you can see they keep going to Norway, and that's very often what they do. I'm not asking you to agree on anything. I'm just inviting you to spend a few days in Oslo. So let's come along. And those principles really work very well for that reason. Bring people into the room, tell them they have to live together, and they can give each other hell or make it more bearable. And what comes out of this is pledges. They go back and say, I'm going to talk to my government. I like you, so I think I know you expected to deliver something, so I'm just going to give it to you. I don't know what kinds of pledges I can bring you, but I'll try to make it as clear as possible. And what happens is countries come up with unconditional pledges. I will do this. But if you do the same, I'm going to do even more, and I won't expect you to do that. It's what we call conditional pledges. So what Costa Rica, Mexico, and Peru did is, according to the principles of the other regime, only wealthy countries had to do something. So Costa Rica and Peru said, according to the principles, we the poor and the weak are not supposed to sacrifice part of our wealth to fix your problems, but we want to do this. So we are going to allocate a certain percentage of our wealth to fix the climate problem that you created, and that's okay. And if you're willing to improve, we will do even more. And that really caught on. It was a moral lesson that you don't have to be the wealthiest or the most powerful to actually make a difference. So it's the power of morality as well. A couple of ideas here. Has the regime worked? The idea is that it has. So there was a projected increase in greenhouse gas emissions in 2015 that it was going to increase by 16% between then and now. And now we're looking at a 3% increase. So everything that we talked about, bringing people into the room, telling them that the agreements are open-ended, that we're really on trust, and we're about building relationships that have actually worked in slashing 13 points of increases in emissions out without really having concrete targets. So it does work. In part because countries have been realizing that the low-hanging fruit comes from technology. If we invest in technology that is appropriate to the problem, we're more likely to be able to fix it. So if the problem is that fossil fuels are the biggest problem, we can fix the problem in a number of ways. We can still keep burning fossil fuels more efficiently. So there's significant improvements there. Or we can develop technologies to move ourselves away from fossil fuels. So the investments in renewable technology have improved considerably and the costs have fallen. And that has really, really helped. To the point that in some places the cost of renewable energy is cheaper than that of coal, oil, and natural gas. And that has really worked a lot. In 2024, this is one of the latest bits of data that I have. This is let me point to this. This is a leading organization that studies the average cost of energy from different sources, and the latest report that was released in 2024 shows that the cheapest of all energies is photovoltaic, industry solar, and onshore wind. Third comes natural gas, which here in the Milwaukee area, you're investing in state-of-the-art natural gas plant, 2 of them. The Oak Creek 2 coal-burning power plants are converted into gas. So that would be the third cheapest. You could have done better had you gone with solar and wind. But you've chosen to go with gas, so well, you claim bronze. I think you should go for gold. I'm oversimplifying the argument, of course, and I'm trying to provoke you into fighting back, which I hope you will. I'm just here to tell you how horrible you are, okay? In case you missed the point. Okay, so do we have interesting data to support what I'm saying, to support the argument in the readings? Yes, of course. And one of the arguments that the author is making is if emissions in just less than a decade were projected to increase by 16%, and now we're looking at 3%, it means the international regime has actually been quite effective. Not perfect, but quite effective. The problem is what he calls the distributional issue. We haven't quite figured out the free riding problem at the national level. Why should Wisconsin do it? Why should Illinois do it? Why should Texas do it? Why should Texas support the move to renewables if we thrive on dirty energy? What's in it for us? Are you going to destroy the Texas industry? It's hard to argue against that one. So those kinds of what we call distributional issues is what's keeping us from doing the homework that we know we have to do. And we know how to do it. We're just not doing it for that reason. So let me breeze through some data and I will summarize what you're looking at. So here is the trend of greenhouse gas emissions for the US in the last couple of decades, 3 decades. 1990 is used as a baseline year to calculate emissions because 1990 is the year when we exceeded the capacity of the Earth to retire the greenhouse gas emissions we were generating. So that's when we ran out of credit. We're on an overdraft since 1990. So what we see is a trend down in the US, and that's an important lesson. This is Wisconsin, and we see that Wisconsin is similar to the US, not exactly the same. The reason for that is because the economy of Wisconsin is a little different from that of the US. And what gives us jobs? Some industries are more likely to generate greenhouse gases than others. So there's a diversity across states. But the point is we're tracking down as well. Not as fast as we could or should, but we are. I'm not going to go into this, but this is in case you're interested in looking at differences at the state level. You can just click here and spend hours clicking on graphs and tables to see what states generate more emissions, which ones have increased their emissions in 5 years, in 10 years, which ones have lowered their emissions. So you've got a lot of information there that you can really enjoy procrastinating over if you want. But from a climate perspective, it doesn't matter. The climate doesn't care whether emissions are being produced in Wisconsin, in Illinois, or in Vermont. Vermont, for example, does not generate a single watt of energy from fossil fuels. It's all renewables, which sounds great, but they don't generate as much as they need, so they import it from Canada, and it's all dirty. So that's why it matters to know, what's powering you and, read the fine print. Okay, so back to the graphs. Let's get into Wisconsin. So there is differences across states and within states as well. And I really wanted to pause a little bit to look at Wisconsin. So what we're looking at here is where the emissions of greenhouse gases are in Wisconsin. And I point out a few counties here. This is by county. So you can see Milwaukee tops the chart, and you can see that, Rock County, which is where Beloit is, you can see we are at the bottom in 2010, but we can see when it comes to dirty raises, we are only moving up. So what is going on here? So what is it that Kenosha is doing? What is it that Rock County is doing? Why is Madison so flat in county? So those are questions that I'm hoping to be able to get you to think about. Another thing that is important to think about is that there's some places where people are living, and there's some places where people are living as well. But in some places there is more people than others. So if you're going to generate greenhouse gas emissions, we need to think about that greenhouse gas emissions generate chemicals that have an impact on human health. So whenever those emissions are happening, that means that people are being exposed to chemicals that can cause respiratory conditions, autism, cancer. So if the data is correct, we should see a correlation between the places where the emissions of greenhouse gases are higher and the prevalence of these conditions. So that is the hypothesis based on science. So per capita, what we see is that Milwaukee is not doing bad, but look who is going up again, and that's Rock County. So we start to see a trend. So Rock County, again, West Beloit seems to be going up in absolute terms and per capita. Milwaukee, it seems like emissions are flat, but per capita, they're going down. So we see changes happening there. And this is the trend, the projected trend into 2030. Here it is where things are starting to get more interesting, because we can see that it's Milwaukee and Rock County, the ones that really stand out from the others. We see that all of these counties are pretty much flat, going down to zero. Columbia, population 56,000. The reason why it's there is because one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases is there. That's why I put Columbia here, but that is expected to shut down by 2030. So we look at Green Bay, Madison, Beloit, Janesville, Columbia, Kenosha, Milwaukee. Those are the bigger ones. Okay, let's keep looking at the data. Per capita, that looks really good actually, except that the climate doesn't care. You can get lost with accounting tricks, but if the emissions are there, where they're coming from, how many per capita don't matter, except that they do for the people who are living next to the emissions, because that means they're getting exposed. So now what we see is that Milwaukee is actually not that bad. In fact, it's not even in the top 3, but Rock County really is in a league of its own. So that means that the people of Rock County are exposed at a much greater rate to the pollutants generated by fossil fuels than the rest of the people in the state of Wisconsin. Will be by 2030, and that is what we're talking about. By a lot, 20 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 in Rock County, and you can see that Milwaukee won't be the cleanest, but is definitely not anywhere near Rock County or Beloit. And we can see that the Danes and Kenosha, they're doing okay. Columbia could do better. Green Bay area could do better too. But what's going on in Beloit? Okay, let's keep thinking about that. If Milwaukee, Chicago, Beloit were countries, here's where they would be. Look at the left, that's Chicago, Cook County. Not bad. What that means is people in Chicago are very smart, and they either are very efficient in how many emissions per capita they need to do their business, or they have political clout and they put their dirt outside of the county and they still power the city. Let's think about that as a hypothesis. The reason why I put Duluth, Minnesota there is because I also put Superior, Wisconsin here. They're powered by the same companies, but the polluters are on the Wisconsin side. So, but if you were to, if you didn't know that, you would think that Duluth, Minnesota is a climate role model, is the Costa Rica of the Midwest. But it's not. They're free riders. Up to a point, they're so close to each other that, you know, the pollution once in the air, depending on the temperature, the prevailing wind direction, you know, it travels across Minnesota. Pollution doesn't really understand Minnesota, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is not too bad compared to that. It's actually better than the national average. Wisconsin is worse, but look at Beloit. It would be the worst offender in the world, with a couple of exceptions out there. So what we see here is Beloit and Superior, Wisconsin, if this plant actually happens, which is in the works, it's not in place yet. What we're looking at in terms of, oh, I forgot the L there, that's pollution. Okay, so Beloit is comparable to Qatar, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Trinidad and Tobago. Those are all oil, gas industries. So what we have here is a typical pattern of places that rely very heavily on fossil fuels. So that's really what we're looking at. Which means that the international regime seems to be working very well because we are reducing our emissions. But the question is, what happens when we go home? What happens in Wisconsin is that we are throwing all of our dirty energy onto Beloit. We're shutting down the more polluting plants in the state of Wisconsin, to clean up Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, we're putting it in Beloit. Which means you're gonna be able to keep your lights on because we are gonna be taking more pollution than most citizens of anywhere in the world. And that, I think, invites ethical questions. Should we weave ourselves out of fossil fuels? Yes. But should you, people of Milwaukee, those of Madison, do it by not cleaning up, just by dumping it on Beloit? That's the policy of Wisconsin. And I would argue it's wrong, regardless of where I live, but it's particularly wrong if I happen to live downwind from the power plant, which has increased emissions. The power plant in Beloit generates more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire county of Cook, where the city of Chicago is, population 5 million. That's what we're talking about. So, to think about this, it helps to realize that we do have a lot of resources, financial and institutional. And that because at the international level, the climate regime is becoming very effective, now the problem is playing out outside of the cameras at the big international negotiations, or even outside of the federal government. Whether the federal government decides to invest in renewables or not does not matter. Wisconsin has decided that it will and is, and it's cleaning up the big cities. But the argument is, what if we don't have enough renewables? What if the sun doesn't shine for a few days? What if the wind doesn't blow? Well, we still have to have gas, and we're gonna put it in Beloit. Because the citizens are docile, they're uneducated, they're poor, they're not reading the newspaper, and they don't know we're doing this. Except for me. And here I am to tell you, okay. So industry is taking note. Insurance companies are basically taxing people more if they choose to basically build in harm's way, which means that health insurance in Beloit is going up. Because you have less pollution, you're expected to be healthier, but we're not. Which means that you just made my health potentially worse, and my health costs potentially higher, which means I'm going to probably lose purchasing power because my salary will go down because I will miss days of work, and then I will have medical costs at a rate that you don't. It's what we call by distributional issues. It also means that is this what we call pollution havens. There's this argument that the best way to deal with pollution is to make people own it. My students use a different expression about owning pollution, but they don't call it pollution. And starts with the sh, but I will leave it at that. Again, very visceral about this. But there's actually empirical evidence. Science shows that if you have to live with that, you're more likely to either not produce it in the first place, or find a way to deal with it. But if you can dump it on Beloit, then you don't have to think about any of the above. And that's what we call pollution havens. These are communities that are exposed to pollution at a higher rate. The way it's defined in policy is, where are we gonna put the power plant? What community has higher tolerance for pollution? And normally poor, more diverse, more immigrants who don't speak the language, politically weak or disenfranchised, and because they're not represented behind closed doors when these decisions are made. You are, I'm not. We get that. Okay, so if insurance companies are quantifying what is the cost of pollution on people, on the communities, so the closest we have is the market for greenhouse gas emissions, which is in California. So California mandates that anybody who's going to pollute has to pay for the cost of pollution, which is a principle of American environmental law. The polluter pays. And California said, okay, you're going to generate emissions. I will give you the right to pollute at this price, which means that if you pollute, you pay, which means you have an incentive to lower your pollution. This was the cost in 2024 of a ton of pollution, which based on Beloit's emission, that means pollution will cost Beloit $53 million in terms of health insurance to all the citizens of Beloit and other conditions. The data is a combination of the data from the pollution exchange and the EPA in terms of population. I think there is a comment in the room.
Yeah. Well, it depends on how you count Beloit's emissions.
Right.
Emissions. If you count it as point source only affecting local,
right,
then that's the cost to Beloit.
Yes.
But really, it should be spread out over all those who are receiving the benefit of the fossil fuels that is being located in Beloit.
Correct.
Which would include
Rockford,
adjacent counties.
Exactly.
Maybe Rockford, I don't know what gets sold to Rockford.
A lot. Rockford is non-attainment. It has some of the highest air pollution in...
Okay, so you probably don't sell them a lot.
Yeah.
But they probably get it. They probably get it downwind.
Correct, yes. So this is just an oversimplification for educational purposes, but you're absolutely right.
But it's an equity issue.
It is.
The payment is due, and the question is from whom?
And to whom?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, a poor farmer who generates very little, except for his cows, pollution, greenhouse gases in California, has to pay for PG&E with its, heavy metals and all that other stuff, plus their CO2. Is it fair for that farmer to pay the same as the people who make the decisions that this will be spread out over all of the consumers of electricity?
Yes, excellent. We're in total agreement. Excellent. Yes. So I'm gonna go a little faster because you're really asking the right questions. That's exactly the point that I wanted to bring up. Is the equity issue. Who pays? Who is in the receiving end? Excellent points. Yes. So it's what we call emissions leakage. Yeah, the emissions are not contained by political borders. Where are they going? The parties generating them are not paying for the cost, which means that there is what we call a negative externality. And this is an environmental justice issue. If the polluter pays, who is the polluter? Who do they pay? Do we have a mechanism to enforce the payment? Who is receiving it, etc.? And we don't have a good plan for that. That's why Wisconsin and Illinois are basically fighting it out in the courts. Illinois and Wisconsin believe pollution comes across the border. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said last year, you figure it out. So it is very complicated. Okay, but the fact remains that if we look at, the idea is if there's a correlation between environmental conditions and health conditions, we do see that Milwaukee and Beloit tend to top the charts for the wrong reasons. Rates of hospitalization for asthma, unemployment, which is a predictor for polluting industries, there's correlation there, lead poisoning. Here what we see, for example, in Milwaukee, some parts of Milwaukee are okay. So we can see that you guys here in Franklin are okay. You have new infrastructure, newer buildings. But if you really look at Beloit, we are very similar to Sherman Park neighborhood here in Milwaukee, one of the older parts, low income, etc. So we do see some, back to the point, clear environmental justice issues because there is clear differences across, and that makes it very hard to enforce. Do it. In Beloit, if you really click to the map to the local level, these are the tracts where I live. So that's because Beloit's very small, so there's a couple of it's only 3 districts, and that is for the one where I live is the older part of Beloit. So, to conclude, China has decided that, we're doing it no matter what, and you can go with me or not. And what we see is that the US is not very interested in exercising leadership at the local level, at the international level or at the federal level. However, it is important for us to remember that investments in renewable take generations to develop, that the result of generations, the result of billions of dollars in investment, and they're also the result of many countries and governments working together. There was a big push in the 1970s in the US to to invest in renewables. That went away in the 1980s. Then that interest grew in Europe. There was a big push in Europe in the 90s and 2000s. There was more impetus in China to clean up the air in the 2010s. So all of those benefited from the investments, the know-how, and the technology of the previous ones. California was the leader in the 70s, Europe in the 2000s, 1990s, 2000s, China is one of the leaders today. So it does matter that we have an international approach to this, because we can only do it if we're willing to invest these gigantic investments. But the US matters a lot, not just because it is a major emitter, but because the US has a lot of power at the international level. Power that is very hard to measure, just like the environmental justice issue. How do you measure these kinds of power? The US is a country that, unlike China, has developed a very, very thick mat or network of international agreements with countries that bind each other to doing the same thing. China hasn't. China likes to go solo. It does not want to be tied up. Which means that if the US says we're going to do this, other countries are bound by international law to follow law. We call that instrumental power. The US has people with the brain power to do it. We call that intellectual power. Directional power. People around the world look at the US. Well, if the US does it, that probably is the right thing to do. We probably should do it as well. So all of those are really important aspects of American power, not to mention the material power of technology, etc. So it does matter a lot if the US does it. And it has shown that it can work. The question is, where do we take it from here if the US does not lead? If the US does not lead, we're putting things in the hands of lawyers who can find openings in the law to try to move in the direction of international law in the absence of new international law. And we might be able to do that. What's the precedent? Can we find a case where there was international global pollution that we needed to act on? If new legislation doesn't happen, been there before. We can, climate change legislation is informed by the Montreal Protocol that was developed to phase out CFCs to address the hole in the ozone layer. So we might be going in that direction, but it's a very difficult thing. You know, think about this. If it comes to lawyers in a dark room, it's probably not the best environment. So what can we do? And I think that's one of the takeaways from the readings. I mean, we can all do more at the local level. And these are the kinds of things that we can do. We need to make sure that we are educated and that we push our communities to move in the right direction, in the direction of renewables. And that is by talking to our elected officials, by expecting that our utilities can and should do better, by educating our neighbors, celebrate the initiative to put solar panels on the library's roofs, and to participate in as many projects as you can. Because that's it's really not rocket science. We know what the problem is and how to fix it. We're just not doing it. So with that, I think I'll pause. I think there's lots of excellent comments already in the room, and I'm sure there will be more. So I really thank you for your patience, and I look forward to a very enlightening debate. Thank you. And Jennifer, there's still lots of hands there. I don't know how you go about.
If anybody wants a microphone, I can hand. If anybody wants the microphone, I can hand it over. But if you have a loud voice, you might be just fine.
I can try to be loud.
The question for those online. Yeah.
Right. For 30 years, maybe a little bit longer, the U.S., Canada, and Europe have all been declining in the amount of carbon dioxide that they put in, at least from what I can find on the internet. Question is, where we are now and where we need to be by whatever standard anybody is using to stop global warming, where do we have to go? How much do we have to, what did it say, 16% for the U.S.?
Yeah, the easy answer is that we shouldn't be generating any.
Well, that's not a real answer, though.
It is. That's what we know, but we're not there. So let me just see if we can remember. This is the trend. We should bring that as close to zero as possible. And then we should be working on our sinks, what we call the sinks. Whatever emissions we're generating, how do we sink that? Do it into the trees, to other alternatives.
But is there a number where it would stop besides zero? I mean, it wasn't zero back in 1750 either. My grandparents were burning coal in Milwaukee to heat, and I'm burning natural gas.
Yeah, so the chemicals in the atmosphere will not go away immediately. So even if we eliminate all of our emissions, the problem is not going to go away. So that's why we need to lower emissions as fast as possible, close to zero as possible. There's a big debate as to whether we should go net zero or carbon neutral. But I mean, that sounds like right now is like a pie in the sky. We should totally go, as fast as we can, and we're not moving fast enough. So I mean, I really can get into the details of that, but it is, as you mentioned, pointless. It's unrealistic to expect. We need to go to zero. We know that, but we are really not doing it. So we have to make as much progress as fast as we can.
Okay. I'm just not going to stop breathing though, because I'm emitting carbon dioxide too.
Right. Yes, we certainly wouldn't expect that. That would be a
not right now.
Environmental injustice. Yes.
So I just had one quick question. We were talking about what is the hang time for this pollution right now, based on projections? How long is it going to take to get rid of it if nothing else is done except planting trees?
Well, planting trees will help.
Right.
They will store carbon for a while until they die and they don't anymore. But the problem that we have is that we are still generating more while they will stay in the atmosphere for decades, even if we stop generating them. So that's why at the beginning I opened with mitigation. We need to eliminate all emissions, but the problem is not going to go away because we'll still live in a warmer planet, which means we need to adapt. We need to adapt to more extreme weather events. So that means we need to build the infrastructure. We need to create avenues of adaptation so that we engage the issues of environmental justice that we talked about. Some communities are doing more than others. Is that just? Some communities are benefiting more than others. Is that just? Some communities are being exposed to more pollutants as a result of climate emissions leakage. That's probably not fair either, but we don't have a clean, elegant way of getting there because we're really not coordinating our policies at the international, national, state, and local level. And the best policy is the one where all of those align, but we know we're not going to do that. And we need to do something to bring it back. There it is. It's coming back.
So the whole thing was, I know you didn't answer it, but I just want to clarify. So even if things would shut off right now, we still have 20 years worth of stuff in the air that's going to hang there, basically.
Well, into the 22nd century,
right,
yes.
Right. Basically, it's just going to hang there. So we need to make those improvements, so we're not just adding to that mess.
But we are.
But we are.
And will. Yes.
That's why I put it.
Yes.
What
You
is
were
it?
getting a little bit off topic from the article, so I'm trying to stay within the article. Because we can really go in all kinds of directions. I really don't know who's next. I apologize. I'm looking at you. Exercise your authoritative ways.
The gentleman.
Two questions. What is a greenhouse gas? And what is Beloit certificate emitter?
The greenhouse gas are the gases that get trapped in the atmosphere and they prevent the heat from escaping. So they create what we call a greenhouse gas effect. It's a metaphor that we use. If you walk into a greenhouse on a sunny day, the temperature is going to be higher than outside. And that's what's happening to the atmosphere because we burn things that stay there and keep the heat from leaving the atmosphere.
CO2?
Methane and others, yes. And the reason why Beloit is a big emitter is because the power plant keeps doubling capacity every few years as we shut down power plants in other parts of Wisconsin. So we're really concentrating the pollution in Beloit.
I don't know if you're pointing at me, but Oak Creek, I'm sorry, Oak Creek had a hearing today, or yesterday I should say. What are they building, and is that going to be worse, make us more of a polluter? Or?
Yeah, so for comparison, Cook County emits about, so if you look at the reported emissions, industry level emissions. So I think as you mentioned earlier, those are not all the emissions, but the ones that we document that are made available through the EPA website so we can compare. The latest year was 2023. Cook County emitted just under 2 million tons of greenhouse gases. The plant in Beloit emitted 3 million. Oak Creek emits 11 million, 9 to 11, because that really varies on it's a function of a number of things: technical, maintenance, demand, weather, etc. So the Oak Creek power plants are the single biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the state of Wisconsin. They're there with the Columbia Power Plant. But the plan by We Energies is to shut them down, bring the energy from Beloit, and convert them into gas, so that when they operate, they will have equal generation capacity, but half the emissions. And that's what explains the drop in the emissions in Milwaukee, and the fact that Beloit's power plant is going to be the backup for the plants that we idle in Milwaukee. Madison-Dade County passed local law that bans the generation of energy in the county through burning fossil fuels, which is why the local utility there uses dirty energy. They can't produce it there, so they buy it from Beloit.
Is a utility a corporation?
It's a utility owned by a corporation, WEC. Yes, and We Energies, WEC, and the utility in Green Bay is also, I think, part of the WEC family. But when we're talking about power plants, those are very big investments of resources long term. So there is no free market in the sense that, you know, the public, so there's a commission in Wisconsin, again, I don't want to get too lost into the weeds, that has to evaluate the proposals of the utilities for upkeep and investment in new plants, for decommissioning plants that have to be coordinated across companies across the states. And that's why, even though We Energies and Alliant operate in different regions, they have to agree to be there for the other in case there's a problem in each one of the areas of service. And that's why when We Energies decides to shut down one of the two generators of Oak Creek, they can ask Alliant to send the energy from the Beloit power plant. And that can be just an agreement. It could be mandated by the state, or in this case, We Energies can directly buy stocks in the power plant in Beloit, which is something that We has done to guarantee themselves control over that power plant and the energy that comes from that, even though it's run by Alliant.
Is there somebody on this
Can I
side?
just quickly say something? You made it sound like it's already done, and it's not done.
No, it's in the works.
We can write. There are dockets we can comment yet until I think April 7th. So if you want to, you can do that.
Okay, Vince?
Yeah, actually, where do you see like nuclear energy falling in this whole goal of trying to improve the climate?
There's a big debate. Greenpeace, for example, which is one of the world's leading environmental organizations, is split on this. Nuclear, if done right, doesn't generate emissions. Yeah. And that's what the direction Illinois has gone. There were a number of nuclear power plants that were nearing the end of their life in Illinois, and through a number of roundabout ways, the state of Illinois has come up with a very aggressive climate policy that involves keeping those operational for a number of years. So for Illinois, it's keeping emissions lower than the alternative. They don't have enough energy coming from renewables to make up for that coming from nuclear power plants. So they decided to keep them operational and retire them gradually as renewable energy comes online. So that really is it's a no-brainer, provided that you're okay with the waste at the plant. Because whatever nuclear power plant there is out there has to store the waste on site. So, and it's been done safely for the most part. So, but some communities think, okay, we'll take it, and some communities say, I don't want it here. So that's where we are at.
Yes.
AI is going to be the thing, and quantum computing over the next many years. And the amount of power that those constellations of computers use is huge. And it is estimated it'll be, at least 10% of U.S. power before too long. So what will be the implications of this for our action on reducing greenhouse gases? And what are the alternatives that would make it less counterproductive to reaching that goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no clear answer. I participated in a workshop led by people from Google, from a number of one of these high-tech companies that were developing these projects. And they basically said, we don't really know the answer to that. We're doing our very best. But this is new ground. We don't know. So many of them are saying that, we try to do the right thing, so we'll go to the communities that have cleaner energy, but we need reliable energy. That's the caveat. So for some of them, that means nuclear. For some of them means hydro. So some communities in the Rocky Mountain region are actually attracting these because they have reliable hydro. There's hydrology works in cycles, so it's not steady, but it is reliable according to some. And some others are saying we just go to the community that takes us, and it's up to City Hall to decide how they get the energy that they do.
Microsoft, for example, is building a big facility, an AI facility, here in Wisconsin. And that can only be serviced, I assume, by either Beloit or Oak Creek.
It doesn't, the generation will have to happen where the generation facility is.
Yeah.
But the plant itself, the storage facility does not have to be there. It doesn't have to be there. So that there is a lot of flexibility with that. One of the challenges with this is that depending what technology ends up, I'm being cautious here because what direction, what's the right technology, we don't know. But these facilities generate a lot of heat. And one of the ways to cool them down is to use water. That's one of the approaches. So being close to a community that has water is a plus. So Milwaukee, Chicago, looking very interesting, but there's a number of lower income community adjacent to them that are trying to attract those. They don't have the rights to Lake Michigan water, which means they're counting on their ability to call upon the Great Lakes, agreement, so that because they're adjacent to, that they would be able to benefit from that, just like Waukesha did. But when Waukesha got these to go in this direction, there was also an agreement that communities wouldn't abuse this. So that's where we're going. So we don't know exactly what the answer is. The people who participated in this conference said, we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what the right policy is. But we need to get there. So we're trying to figure it out. So I don't have a good answer for that. I actually read a story a couple of days ago about how they're trying to collaborate, competitors are trying to collaborate in developing different strategies in the sense that we don't know which one is going to be more effective from an economic perspective, less dangerous from an environmental perspective, more acceptable from a social political perspective. So in a way, they're all trying to agree to go in different directions to see which one sticks.
Jay, did you have a question?
On that first slide you had there, I think it was China was 30% and U.S. was 13%. Now, isn't that kind of a bogus comparison because China's got, what, 2 billion people and we've got 330 million?
Yeah, you're asking excellent questions that could keep us busy for years. I love spending time with my students when I teach climate accounting. So from a climate perspective, the planet doesn't care what the emissions are. But when it comes to politicians, they have to go home and say, I got a good deal out of it. So what does a good deal really mean? So what happens at international negotiations is that each country will argue that offering that statistic makes China look bad. But the US likes it because it makes China look bad. So China instead is suggesting that we look at the share of emissions over unit of economic output, because that makes China look very good. India, which is the fastest growing emitter of the big ones, wants share of world's quota of emissions, or share of the atmosphere. Because if you go by that, the US and China need to cut down exponentially, while India can continue to increase exponentially as well. So this is one of the challenges of the international climate regime, because it's non-binding other than we need to do it. Then the US says, I like that statistic. China says, no, I have a better one. India says, I have a better one. So, but in the end of the day, the planet doesn't care. We can spend all time we want discussing which one is better, but the emissions will do what they do. So yeah, I love to give the students assignments that will make emissions look very different depending on what criteria you use. But then in the end of the day, de facto, although not necessarily de jure, de facto, the Chinese and the Indian delegators go home and say, well, that really is the one that matters, but I have to tell you in public because my government wants you to denounce your accounting mechanism and to say that we better do it this way, but because you're not good citizens of the world and you Americans, are bullies and you are imperialists, we have to use your system. I have to say, now let's go behind closed doors and be serious about this. So that's a lot of what happens in these negotiations as well, and that's the Norwegian approach. Go out there, say what you need to say so your people are happy, and then let's get into the room and actually get it done. And when it comes to getting into the room and getting it done, there is little disagreement on the fact that we have to get it done. The question is who does what and what when we go home. I think, yeah, those at the front don't realize there's people at the back who've been trying to get the floor for a while.
What about fusion energy? Is that going to save us in the long run?
That's one of those technologies like, waves and so the answer is potentially, but we don't have the infrastructure in place to make it viable in the short run.
Well, I'm talking about in the future.
Yes,
right
so
now, there's nothing left.
That's correct. So that the idea is, it's a little bit what the big technology companies are doing. We need to make sure we keep doing that so that the technology matures, the price drops, and at some point it might be viable. We can't park it. But, the need is now, and right now it's solar and wind that are the cheaper ones, and then gas, and we should probably prioritize those.
I'll go back over here.
One thing, just something reminded me while you were talking, and I hate to quote the person I'm going to quote, but there was that young Scandinavian girl that was traveling the world. Greta, yeah. And she was talking about how, we've got to cut down, everything has to go like this. And I remember at some conference, and I think it was a UN conference, and the head of Russia said to her by himself, he said, there's over 1 billion people in India that want the lifestyle that you have in Scandinavia, and they need energy to get it. And that's, you can't, for us, for people to get up to the lifestyle that we've got that they want, it's going to require some other form of energy other than the fusion type would be the nearest thing.
Yes.
But it's only 20 years away, they told me, in the 1950s.
Yeah, and that's why India and China are really, really huge on solar and wind right now. They're the fastest investors there because they need to get there, they need to go fast, and they need to go cheap, and that's why they're doing it. And the US is kind of like, I wouldn't say too far behind, but they're falling behind on that. And so that's what China and India are going, which are the ones who have those immediate needs. And one of the advantages of solar and wind is that you don't have to put a huge power plant with the necessary infrastructure to get the energy generated at the plant to every village. What solar and wind have going for them that makes it cheaper and more practical is that you can have a small park in every village. And that's the direction they're going because they need that. And what you're alluding to is what another case of environmental justice is what we call intergenerational ethics. you know, why are we in the room, the ones setting the policy that will shape the future, if there's very little in it for us? It's the people who will be around in 2100, the ones who should be telling us what policy they want, except that we don't have a political system that gives them a voice, because they're not born yet. And this is one of the frontiers of research. How do we address the ethical problem across not the space dimension, but the time dimension? And we're not doing very good at that. Because those of your generation or mine are more likely to go vote. So there is an incentive for politicians to do what we want, not those who are not born yet. It's what we call the shadow of the future. It's called future discounting as well.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions.
My question, wondering, in the world, honoring the earth itself and keeping it healthy and keeping us healthy, are there any places or cultures that you find to be in balance when we talk about the environment?
Well, from a climate perspective, I mentioned Norway earlier. Norway wants to be the first carbon neutral country in the world. So by that we mean a country that retires emissions, that sinks emissions, we call those carbon sinks, more than they generate. And they want to be the first country to do that. Okay, except that Norway is a major producer and exporter of gas. So they're really making the problem worse, except that they drive EVs and they have renewables, but they export their gas to be burned in Europe, in other countries. So to me, the environmental ethics argument, Norway, I'm sorry.
Patrons, the time is 7:45, and our library will be closing in 15 minutes.
We must have
If
many
you have
more
items you
agents
wish
in the
to
room
check
because
out,
of
we ask
silencing.
that you
Okay,
wait to the
but
checkout desk
Costa
at
Rica
this
has a
time.
better
Thank
argument
you.
because they actually do not produce fossil fuels. But the best is a country that is already carbon positive, which is Bhutan. Because Bhutan produces a lot of hydro, more than they need, so they send it to India, the excess production, so that India can do the things that you mentioned without necessarily having to build additional facilities. So, but the truth is, Bhutan is so small. It's one of those countries where it's great if everybody could be Bhutan, but does it really matter? From a global perspective, it doesn't. It offers a way forward. Costa Rica, to me, is probably more meaningful in the sense that they had to get where they are today by investing in renewables, by rebuilding, by bringing the forest back that they had destroyed. It's great that Norway is doing EVs and renewables, but they're also producing a lot of gas. And, you know, yes, it has to come from somewhere to weave ourselves out of coal, but it's a very complicated argument. So I'm not going to give gold to Norway this time.
One more in the far back, and then anybody can stay behind and talk with Dr. Toral.
Until we get pushed out.
Until we get pushed out.
Have you factored in, or not you, but have they factored in the cost of supposedly this renewable energy with batteries, mining interests, solar panels, may short-term create comfortable economic advantages, but what about the waste and the pollution levels down the road?
Yes, that's another question my students hate to know a lot about. The dirty side of clean energy, because they bring that up too. So we don't have a lot of time, but I want to acknowledge this is a real question. Because think about the mining for rare earth minerals. And if they're coming from China, China mines those by removing thousands of people forcefully. So they can mine those, and then they leave a wasteland, and that's what's powering the EVs. And yet, the climate doesn't care. We still have a problem. Is that the way to do it? Of course not. So it is terrible. I'm going down the slides because I wanted to bring up a website where you can actually look more into that if you want. I forgot where it is. Is this one? Maybe we can take the next question while I find it. If I do, I pointed it out earlier.
Okay.
Well, 40 years ago, we sent a harnish figure machine over to Oslo, Norway, to a city incinerator. And they said they were burning all the waste from Oslo, but they had scrubbers. Now, do we have scrubbers on our power plants?
We do, and there's different kinds. Some that are more effective than others, but they're more expensive. So when you're talking about, some people call these burning waste, biofuels. There is emissions that go with that as well. So that's very commonly done across different parts of Europe, especially Central and Northern Europe. In the US, Puerto Rico is the one that has really done that for a longer time because they're an island. So they've decided that rather than burying it, they were going to burn it. But that still generates lots of plastics that get burned. You know, there is, chemicals that go up into the atmosphere eventually. You know, they fall into my yard and pollute my tomatoes.
Yeah, but when you look out here in Franklin, you got a little Mount Olympus going on here. Wouldn't there be an awful lot of energy just being buried in there?
Yes, we have that in Rock County as well. We have an incinerator in Janesville, but it also generates lots of greenhouse gases and pollution as well. So I sense we're being pushed out. I don't want to censor this, but I wanted to point out that this is the levelized cost of energy. Is a study that looks at all of those things longer term, and you can really spend a lot of time clicking your way through it. It will give you the current cost of harvesting the energy, the long-term cost over the life, the operation of the technology, how it is affected by changes in the cost of sources of energy. So you can really look at all of these, and the overall results as of June 2024 is that the cheaper ones are industrial solar and onshore wind, followed by gas. And that's again what's making solar and wind grow so fast in Illinois, in west of the Mississippi River, in India I mentioned, in China, in Chile, in some countries that decided, wow, this is the time to go, it's the cheapest. If you want big scale generation, then you know that is a little more problematic, a little more complicated because you need a lot of land for this. But what explains the gigantic increase in solar and wind farms in the last 5 years is the collapse in price of them, in the fact that they're cheaper than the alternative in many parts of the world.
Okay, I want to thank Dr. Toral for
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate the interest, and the questions are excellent, and I don't have time to do justice to all of that, so sometimes I know that I was kicking it out of bounds. But you were actually asking excellent questions. The computer is not working the way I expected because it's yours. So it's not the same as mine. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't mess up. Okay.
Before you go, I wanted to mention next Thursday, April 3rd, from 5 to